Thanks very much. Sorry I was late. The polls keep on coming out in a day like this. What I want to do very briefly is to say what this election is and is not about, and to give you some idea of why probably the ballot will look as it does when it's counted on Sunday evening. There are two things about the public attitudes towards Brexit that need to be understood in order to understand this election. Three things, actually. The first is that attitudes have been remarkably stable in the last 2.5 years. Around 85% of people, according to the polling evidence, would vote exactly the same way as they did 2.5, nearly 3 years ago now. Point one, so changing minds is not easy. Point two, we are pretty much evenly divided as a result. On average, it's remained 54, leave 46, but much of that lead is the product not of changing minds, but the views expressed by those who did not vote 3 years ago, who, by the way, are relatively unlikely to vote tomorrow. The third thing you need to understand is that we are deeply polarized. The polling evidence points very consistently to the fact that the two most popular options amongst the public are, one, leaving without a deal, which is the first preference of at least 50% of Leave voters, or to have a referendum stroke, don't even bother with that, but let's just revoke Article 50, which up to 2/3 of Remain voters are in favour of. So our politicians are often told to seek the centre ground of politics, but the problem with Brexit is that the centre ground of politics is poorly populated. And be it Mrs May's deal, Norway, or the Heinz 57 varieties of compromises that people have thought of in between, none of these are particularly popular. They're certainly not very many voters' first choice. This, therefore, creates a premium when it comes to a European Parliament election on clarity. Bear in mind that European Parliament elections are rather peculiar creatures, as Sara will say much more eloquently than I. But there are two or three features of them that are not unique to the United Kingdom, not unique to 2019. There are aspects about them that we've known for a long time. Voters regard them as second-order contests. They don't think they're terribly important. They don't know what the European Parliament is, and they care even less. As a result, they are more inclined to, first of all, say, this is an opportunity to have a free hit against the government. It's the one occasion on which somebody like Lord Heseltine or Lord Kirkup, actually, of course, neither of them could vote in general election, but ignore that for the moment. That the Tories can vote for somebody other than the Conservative Party without fear of letting Jeremy Corbyn into 10 Downing Street. So voters tend to use the elections in order to protest against the government. I mean, I'm reminded this evening, given the somewhat precarious state of the current tenure of the Prime Minister in 10 Downing Street, of what happened on the European elections of 2009 in Gordon Brown's darkest days, when at 10 o'clock on the evening of the election, James Pennell resigned, and there seemed to be signs of a coup against the then Prime Minister. Now, he survived, but the Labour Party ended up with 15% of the vote. So, we've been here before. People vote against the government. The second thing they do is they say, those Greens, well, they're rather nice people, got slightly wacky ideas, but, their heart's in the right place. You know what, let's give them a chance. And of course, environment is a bit of a European issue anyway. If we're going to solve the problems of plastic in the sea, it probably requires a deal of international cooperation. The third thing that they tend to do is, if there's a credible Eurosceptic party around, they are inclined to take the opportunity to, if you're not very keen on the European Union, to use that as an opportunity to express their views about Europe. And again, Sara will tell you how in Denmark, this has long been, it was once a feature of European elections in Denmark, for example. So, given the background of a government that has been unable to deliver Brexit, we have got the perfect environment for a storm against the two-party system. So on the one hand, we've got a government that's trying to implement a Brexit compromise. The Prime Minister is now being very open about the fact that she's trying to pursue a compromise, but is unable so far to deliver. On the other side, deeply ironically, the Labour leader, who is meant to be the most radical Labour leader since the 1930s, is desperately pursuing a compromise on Brexit. But the problem, as I've already situated you, is that it's not where voters are. And indeed, when you ask the voters about where the parties stand, we've got this remarkable situation whereby voters find it easier and are more likely to be agreed upon where the Liberal Democrats stand on Brexit than they are the Conservatives or the Labour Party. And I can tell you after 40 years of studying social science data, that is quite a considerable achievement. And I suspect it's not a recognition of Vince Cable's brilliant campaigning skills, but rather of the way in which the public are confused and frankly follow the intricacies of where the Conservative and Labour parties stood on Brexit, very, very difficult to follow. And of course, the one party that they have no trouble at all knowing where they stand and what they stand for is the Brexit Party. 2/3 of voters have no trouble saying, yeah, I know where they stand. And of course, they stand for a hard Brexit. By the way, about 40% of Leave voters now think the Tories are against Brexit. That's how confused they are. And equally for the Labour Party, around 2/3 of people go, this party stance is confusing and unclear. And basically what's happened in this European election campaign is that votes have gone to the parties of clarity and to varying degrees have moved away from the parties of compromise. The Conservatives only started this European election campaign at 19% in European election preferences. They're now running, on the last time I calculated, and I don't think it's going to vary a great deal, at 11. I'm kind of beginning to think of, what happened to the Canadian Conservatives in 1993 in terms of, disasters for centre-right parties in the world. But equally, the Labour Party has also lost, 5-6 points according to polls. Now, here it has to be said is one area where the polls do not agree with each other. There is very remarkable variance in the polls in terms of their estimates of where the Labour Party stands. So I can tell you that on average it's about 21 or 22, but it ranges from YouGov saying it's 13 to Kantar saying it's 24. So there is considerable disagreement about how badly Labour are doing, but there is agreement within the polls that what's been going on is that Labour's grip on the Remain vote, amongst other things, has been weakening. On average, at the beginning of this campaign, around 40% of the Remain vote was going to the Labour Party. It's now running on average about 30%, and if people like YouGov are right, it is even less. And some polls suggest that there are now more Remain voters who will vote for Liberal Democrats. Who knows what will happen, but certainly that is a battle that's going on. Meanwhile, 75% of those people who voted Conservative in 2017 and who voted Leave are going to vote for the Brexit Party. Many of whom, of course, voted for UKIP in 2014 and in 2015. They only voted for the Conservative Party in the first place because they thought Theresa May was going to deliver Brexit. But now Theresa May has failed to deliver Brexit. They don't understand what she's in favour of and seems to be softening by the day. And meanwhile, Nigel Farage is back to light the true lamp of Euroscepticism. Then the Conservative vote has essentially imploded. Now, of course, the question we then have to ask, and this is the difficult question, is whether this is all simply the product of the peculiarities of the environment created by a European election, which I've already indicated is just perfect for Farage and the Brexit Party and provides the Democrats with an unusually good opportunity, or whether this is going to mark a change in British politics. Well, of course, the honest answer to that question is we don't know, but let me give you the considerations on either side. Now, certainly one of the things that we know about European elections is that when there is a surge for a small party, such as UKIP in 2014, then you tend to find also that there's a tail effect, a coattail effect on that party's level of Westminster support. And at the moment, the Brexit Party is standing at around 19% or so in polls for Westminster intention. So it's not as high as the European election, when it looks as though it might be as much as a third or so, but it's still much higher than any Eurosceptic party's been since 2016. But maybe as we all go away for summer and we enjoy the Mediterranean sun, at least some of us, and we all forget about the European Parliament, this all disappears. But of course, there is a difference about this European election, which is the issue that is at the centre of this election and which has become to structure how people vote to an increasing extent is not going to go away during the summer. It's probably going to burn and sizzle and fry as intensely as it has done as the Conservative Party goes through an internal leadership contest. So therefore, perhaps this isn't going to be temporary. The other reason not to presume that it's temporary is that actually the signs of this were already evident in Westminster voting intention before the European Parliament campaign started. Support for the Conservative, it's difficult to remember now that as recently as mid-November, when Theresa May first unveiled her draft EU treaty, support for Conservative and Labour was running at 39%, both of them. But by the time we got to the end of March, the Tories had eased to 36, the Labour Party had eased to 34, and as soon as we failed to get out of the European Union on March the 29th, the Tory vote began to fall away quite rapidly, down to 30%. And meanwhile, although not back at the level that it had been in 2015, support for UKIP, because this is before Nigel Farage had been reinvented himself, was running at 7 or 8%. It had begun to recover from the squeeze on it in 2017. So the dynamics of what we've seen in this election were already in evidence. And the one exception is the partial revival of the Democrats. That is the product of the last month. It's there now in both Westminster and Remain voting, and it is, by the way, entirely a Remain-generated vote. And the Liberal Democrat vote is now much more of a Remain vote than it ever was previously. And although the Liberal Democrats are not back to the levels that they were before the 2010 coalition, they are now in a stronger position than they ever have been since 2010, which does therefore mean that for the first time, and this is why the challenge to the two-party system is qualitatively different this time. Previously, the challenges have been separate. So the Liberal Democrats used to regularly do well before 2010. They collapsed, and then along came UKIP. And UKIP did well, and then they collapsed. Meanwhile, of course, the two-party system has already been destroyed north of the border, and the SNP are going to easily come first in these elections in Scotland. But what we are now facing is a full-blooded challenge on the socially conservative Brexit side of the spectrum, but also now the signs of at least of a recovery on the Remain socially liberal side of the spectrum, and so therefore the two parties are being squeezed for the first time from both ends of the spectrum. So maybe it will all go away, but I suggest to you that there are reasons it's probably not, and that certainly it's difficult to believe that unless and until the Conservative government actually manages to deliver Brexit, that support for the Brexit Party is going to disappear anytime soon, and that it's a reasonable working assumption that it's probably going to be running at least around 15% in opinion polls for the foreseeable future. I'll then leave you with this final thought. If indeed support for Conservative and Labour is only in the mid-20s by this autumn, the glue of party loyalty, which is the crucial glue that at the end of the day stops most MPs from defecting even when they are deeply unpopular with their party, that glue will begin to look rather weak. And those MPs who at the moment are saying, up with this party I am struggling to put, but I want to keep my political career, up to now have had reason to stick with their party. But if the Conservative and Labour votes continue to be low in Westminster voting intentions, some of those MPs may well begin to say, you know what, what's the point? I might be dead by staying with this party. It might be a hell of a risk joining Kirkup or Joe Swinson or whoever it is who's running Liberal Democrats by this stage.
Okay.
But given the fractious internal nature of both of our two largest parties, they certainly cannot afford the glue of party loyalty to become unstuck, because they are potentially at risk of further defections beyond the quite substantial defections that both of them have already suffered.
John Curtice, thank you very much indeed. Now, obviously, a marvellous summing up. John actually had the easy job, because he just has to talk about one country. Sara is going to try and talk about all the rest. I'm overstating it. But Sara will give us the other side of the European Parliament story, what we can expect to see in the rest of the EU, and then we'll come back to Anand, who will synthesise the two. Is that right? Sort of. Sara.
So yeah, well, obviously going after John, I wasn't going to. I said no, I will have to talk about the EU 27. And in fact, also, I think there are some sort of quite remarkable similarities between the dynamics of the two. But what I wanted to try and address is how Brexit might affect the European Parliament election, and how, in turn, the outcome of the European Parliament elections might affect the Brexit process going forward. And of course, the first thing to note is, while we are all consumed by Brexit and Brexit news, that's not a big issue in the rest of Europe. I mean, we are seeing here 28 different electoral contests, and Brexit is not a main issue outside the UK. But that doesn't mean that Brexit hasn't already had an impact on politics across Europe, other than, of course, the politics of the Brexit process. And perhaps it hasn't quite had the impact that many in Brussels and other European capitals feared back in 2016. Because the kind of impact we've seen is that there has been quite a big shift in public opinion towards more support for membership of the EU. And also a shift in the positions of many, what we might think of as Eurosceptic parties, away from the sort of, oh, let's have a second referendum, and let's have Frexit and Nexit and Lexit and Irexit and Italexit. And some of that is, of course, because Brexit has been a real mess. And so it's not really the sort of poster child of, oh, look at the glorious future we're going to have outside the EU. Instead, it's looked like this is not something that's very easy, it's complicated. And in particular, if you're a country inside the Eurozone, it's likely to be even worse than the sort of scenario that Britain is facing. That doesn't mean at all that Euroscepticism is not alive and well in Europe, but there's been a shift in the rhetoric of a lot of parties, and a shift in polls towards a Euroscepticism that's much more about how can we change the EU from the inside? What are the competing visions of Europe? Is it the sort of Macron's view of a more integrated Europe, or is it more Salvini's or Orban's view of a Europe of nations where we protect our borders, both our borders between each other, but also our external borders? So in that way, Brexit has had a sort of some interesting effects on European politics already. And of course, Brexit, the elections here will also impact the composition of Parliament. These elections weren't going to happen, but now they will happen. As we've heard from John Curtice, they will send likely a lot of Brexit Party MEPs. Of course, that's not entirely new. UKIP already won last time, and so the fact that you have Eurosceptic MEPs is not a big change. Also, from the European Parliament point of view, the good news is they tend not to turn up a lot. So in that sense, they're less disruptive than otherwise. And that's not just sort of a Nigel Farage thing. I mean, generally, what we see with the Eurosceptic national populists in the European Parliament is that they tend to turn up less and vote less cohesively, so even when they look big, they are less effective force than they might otherwise have been if you just look at the numbers. But the things that John Curtice said about how British voters should look at European Parliament elections as second-order elections, as a kind of vote where they have a chance to either punish the national government for being unhappy with their performance, or send a clear signal about something they might care about a lot, like immigration or the environment and so on, but where they might not go that way in a national election about the national government. That's also really what characterizes European parliaments across the other 27 EU member states. And so therefore we have these sort of national second-order elections across Europe, and that leads to a much more polarized and fragmented parliament than we might otherwise see if it was for election for national government. And this time, the suggestion is that the European Parliament will be even more fragmented than before. And there's a couple of things to look out for here when we get the results in at 10 p.m., starting to come in at 10 p.m. on Sunday. One thing is that it looks like the two major groups that have formed the Grand Coalition since the very beginning of direct elections to European Parliament in 1979, namely the Socialists, so the S&D group, the Social Democrats, and the European People's Party, so the Christian Democrats, they've always held a majority together. So if they could agree, then Parliament could come to some kind of consensus. It looks like they will lose their majority this time, and that of course means that there needs to be a bigger Grand Coalition in order to get things through. Now, does that mean then that we have the sort of Salvinis or the Orbans, well, Orban in fact is of course in the European People's Party just about still, that they get to dictate? I think that's unlikely. I think that even if we see greater polarization and greater fragmentation, we'll still see a sort of pro-European centrist majority in the European Parliament after these elections. But it might have to include the Liberals as well, and maybe even the Greens. But they're likely to sort of get together to try and find a common ground on the agenda going forward. Now, of course, the last thing is, and that's again where there's a sort of reflection between, John Curtice talked about how we have the Liberal Democrats and the Greens searching as the sort of progressive pro-European cosmopolitan wing, and the other hand, the Brexit Party as the Eurosceptic, nationally conservative wing. And it's the same sort of battle going on in Europe, even though it's not a battle about whether to stay in or out the EU. And that's really what Macron has said. That is the big battle, and it looks like here that parties on both sides of those ends are going to do better, but of course a lot of the focus is going to be about how well will the national populists do, how well will Salvini, who is the deputy prime minister of Italy, but I guess he's hoping soon to be the prime minister, because his national populist sort of radical right-wing league is really searching in the polls. Right now they're what you might think of as a junior coalition partner to the Five Star Movement, and he's hoping that this is his big chance to take more control nationally, but also at the European level. And he's managed to have more parties on the radical right joining his group, so they will be bigger in the European Parliament. And that can have various effects nationally, but of course also be a disruptive force in Europe. So they tend to not be able to, these parties, agree on a sort of positive legislative agenda. One reason is that, of course, they agree, let's say on foreign policy, they can't agree on whether they love Russia or they hate Russia. On redistribution, if you're in the south, they tend to want to have more money to the south. If you're in the north, the policy agenda of these parties tend to be less redistribution. On immigrants, the Italians and the Spanish national populists want more redistribution of immigrants to other countries in Europe, and of course. So there are some clear policy disagreements, but what they tend to agree on is to be disruptive within the EU, and that can be have a real effect on the legislative agenda going forward. And particularly, that might also have an effect on the Brexit process, because regardless of where we end up, if we end up revoking Article 50, if we end up agreeing some kind of deal, or if we end up with no deal, we have to continue dealing with the EU and Europe. And that means also Parliament. And any kind of negotiation of a trade deal will involve Parliament. And the more fragmented Parliament is, and the more the pro-European forces say, no, we're going to stick together in order to save the European unity, the harder it might be for Britain to get sort of particularly concessions, and the longer it might take to agree something. So in that case, it's not particularly good news. I never thought that Britain could see it as good news if the national populists did better, because then they would come in and help out Britain, as some kind of friend in need. I mean, that's not how national populism generally work. It's sort of Italy first, Germany first, Spain first, and so on. So generally, I don't think we'll see the massive earthquake. I might just, regret that I say this, that some people talk about. I think we'll still have a centrist pro-European majority, but it's going to be a more fragmented and more polarized parliament, and that's going to be a harder negotiation partner for the UK. I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Sara. And now, Anand will bring together the two halves, UK and the EU, to tell us what happens next, basically. By the way, I need to just check your phone. Who's Prime Minister at the moment?
The same one at
Yeah,
the moment.
yeah.
Good,
She's toughing it out. She's been refusing to see cabinet ministers this evening, so they can't resign.
I think Ian Duncan Smith tweeted that she's put the settee in front of the door so no one can get in.
Yeah.
It's kind of summed it up.
She's not easy to get out.
Good start.
Let me just start with some of the things my colleagues have said and then talk a little bit about Brexit. John pointed out that the polls are quite stable, and the polls are quite stable because, in a sense, what you activate when you're talking about Brexit is values. And values don't change very, very quickly. They're very, very sticky indeed. And that's why actually over a long period of time, the polls have remained remarkably constant. And we shouldn't expect quick movements. At the same time, our levels of polarisation have increased very, very clearly. And I would just recommend you all to look at the work that Sara's done. I mean, some of it just quite frightening about how Leavers and Remainers don't just think differently about the future, but view the past economic performance of this country differently through their Leave and Remain lens, or attitudes of Leavers and Remainers towards having a lodger from the other side in their house. I mean, there is a culture war brewing if we're not careful in this country. It has become very, very deep and very, very profound. The other side of that coin, just something that John talked about, is I suppose one of the crucial questions, we don't know the answer to this, but one of the crucial questions of this election is how sophisticated is the British electorate and how good have we become at lending our votes? That is to say, is the British electorate in a place now where it looks at this election, says it's a second-order election, it's proportional representation, we'll lend our votes to the Lib Dems, we'll lend our votes to the Brexit Party. But when it comes to a general election, at a time when there is intense ideological competition between the two big parties, you can no longer say they're all the same when you look at whoever leads the Conservative Party and Jeremy Corbyn. Would a Brexit Party voter really vote Brexit if it makes a Corbyn government more likely? Would a Lib Dem voter really vote Lib Dem rather than Labour if they feel they're making a Boris Johnson government more likely? I mean, that, it seems to me, is one of the big questions of this. And I don't have the answer, so I'm sorry about that, but it's the thing to watch. The other thing to watch about this election, I think, that hasn't been mentioned is turnout. One of the striking things about the 2016 referendum was just how effective the Leave campaign was at getting people on its side to turn out, including, you remember those pictures of council estates with queues to vote, people who didn't normally vote. One of the things to look out for here is whether you have sort of Remainer enthusiasm, whether you have spikes when it comes to turnout in Remainer areas, because that will be interpreted by both camps. I mean, this is the election that will be more over-interpreted than any other, simply because of the Brexit context in this country. And just before I get on to a few remarks about Brexit, I'll also say this matters to Farage partly because success in these European elections means profile and cash. And of course, UKIP drew a large amount of its revenue from the monies they got from the European Parliament, and that matters to the Brexit Party in terms of its future going forward, how much in terms of resources they can get from this. I think in terms of Brexit directly, the most important thing about this election is the signal it sends to MPs. And that signal will be interpreted in terms of where votes go. So, one of the things I think we're likely to be able to see in the aftermath of this election is more Conservative MPs, when they see the party hemorrhaging votes to the Brexit Party, adopting, whether really or rhetorically we'll probably never know, a no-deal approach to Brexit. That is to say, look, we just need to leave because otherwise the Brexit Party poses a threat to us in elections. You can turn that on its head and say, if you look at those famous northern Leave voting Labour seats, if there, rather than Labour votes moving to the Lib Dems, you see Labour votes moving to the Brexit Party, which you could well see in some of those areas, it might, just might, put a bit of pressure on those MPs to think we need to back some deal, any deal. Not because the Brexit Party is going to win seats in a general election, but because the Brexit Party might be enough of an irritant to cost them marginal seats when it comes to a general election. And that's going to be on their minds whether you like it or not. And of course, the other thing that the outcome of this election will weigh on is the Tory leadership campaign. I mean, whether we like it or not, I suspect, Boris Johnson's an interesting figure. Well, in many ways he's an interesting figure. But my sense about Boris Johnson is his tenure as Foreign Secretary and the sort of egregious errors he made, if you think about Nadine Zahawi, you think about Portland Down, were two basic errors over which you might in happier times have expected a Foreign Secretary to resign. I think they served to convince a number of people on his own benches that, actually there's no way of putting this kind of, that behind the buffoonery there was a buffoon. Yeah. If I can put it that way. The flip side of that, I think, is the worse the Conservatives are seen to do in this election, the more they will be tempted to turn to Boris Johnson as the one person in their ranks who can turn it around. So there are two pressures, and I don't know which of those pressures wins out in the end. The other thing I would say about Boris Johnson is I would not put it past him to become Conservative leader and do a screeching U-turn on Brexit. I just do not know what he will do should that happen. Three very quick points about the European Union. One, this election will help dictate who becomes the next president of the European Commission. The higher the chances of it becoming Michel Barnier, the lower the chances of the Commission's approach to the negotiations changing. Because we did see over the last few months cracks appearing in the Commission, with some people criticising what was seen as an overly legalistic approach adopted by Michel Barnier. If the Parliament ends up as the polls predict, I don't see how Weber becomes Commission President, in which case I think that Barnier is probably the favourite to get the job. At that point, the Brexit approach will remain, he will appoint someone in his own image to continue Brexit negotiations if there's a new Prime Minister to negotiate with. Next thing I would say, to mirror what Sara said, is this Parliament will be trickier on trade, because one of the things about both the far left and the far right, and of course underreported, is the fact that the populist surge is going to come from both wings. It's not just a right-wing thing, it is the radical Greens, it is the far left as well. It is a sort of anti-system thing from both sides. But one thing they share is a scepticism about free trade, albeit for different reasons. But that sort of parliament will find it harder to sign off free trade deals. You could expect the left in particular to ask for riders around standards for workers, environmental standards and things like that. This will only get trickier with a new European Parliament. And one final reflection, just thinking back to the days when I used to write about and study the European Union rather than Brexit. I get all misty-eyed now. It's not necessarily a bad thing for either the European Parliament or the European Union that you end up with a fracture along pro and anti-European integration lines, because it actually, I think, makes the European Parliament look like the site of the debate that's happening in national electorates. It makes the Parliament actually seem more relevant in some ways, because that fight that characterises so many member states is also going to be taking place in Brussels. So I wouldn't necessarily argue, look, there are going to be all sorts of populists, this is bad for European integration. There is a possibility that this actually reinvigorates European integration by taking that polarisation and putting it centre stage in Brussels over the next 5 years.
Anand, thank you very much. As I said, I will ask a couple of questions, if I may, before handing over to our friends here. The first question, and I guess the starting point for it is Boris Johnson, what you've just said, Anand, but it's really more a question for John and Sara, maybe. And I should declare an interest. In a previous job, I worked at the Daily Telegraph, and I was Boris's editor. So I have views on his reliability.
You've also written widely on it.
I have written a few things about him. And I also think it is possible that in the character of Boris Johnson, there is the flexibility that would allow him to become Conservative leader with the votes of Tory members who are very keen on a no-deal exit, and then not to deliver that no-deal exit. But I guess the question I want to ask mainly to John and Sara is, what are the range of options for the next Prime Minister? We assume it won't be Theresa May come the autumn. In terms of public opinion, what might this polarised, divided electorate, whose votes are increasingly cast according to their Brexit identity, not their partisanship, what might they accept, if anything? And what do you think, Sara, the the rest of the EU will tolerate? What will they be prepared to countenance in terms of, I mean, essentially in terms of delay or changes to the process, if any? So I don't know who wants to go first on that.
Well, I mean, the question essentially you're asking is how do we get out of this mess?
No, the question is, can we get out of this mess?
Well, I agree.
Or do we stay in this mess
because if you were to ask
mired forever?
Well, I mean, I think the honest truth is that we're heading already fairly rapidly to a request for an extension beyond October. Because if the WAB bill doesn't get a second reading at the beginning of June, we already run out of time. And if we go into the most Tory MPs now seem to have decided that one reason for not letting the WAB go through is they want to give the Prime Minister free rein. Well, that means we start at the beginning of September, and there isn't enough time to get it through. So look forward to the request for an extension.
If I can stop you at that point, given what we know about what has happened to public opinion and voter behaviour after this year's delay, after we missed the March deadline, what happens to the incumbent Prime Minister and the incumbent government that makes that request again?
Oh, well, I take the crucial reason why the request will happen is that the government will fall if it doesn't make the request, because there aren't the votes inside the House of Commons to sustain a government that pursues no deal. And that's just the brutal realpolitik of this House of Commons. I think there are enough Conservative MPs who would bring this government down in the event if it tried to pursue no Brexit. So it's not an option.
Sorry, to pursue no Brexit or to pursue no deal of Brexit?
No deal, yes, exactly.
So essentially the scenario we're talking about, to go back to Boris, Boris becomes Prime Minister with the votes of Tory members who we know would be delighted by Brexit.
He then has to work out how, he's almost undoubtedly going to apply for an extension. Then the question is, how does he try to use that time? If you take the view, as I do, that there isn't much opportunity for pursuing a compromise, but the one thing that sometimes is true in life is that it takes a Tory to implement weak policies. And it might be, and this is a might, and this is a subject of much speculation, it might be that Boris Johnson comes to the conclusion that some people think Theresa May should have come to weeks, if not months ago, which is that the only way you're going to get this country out of the European Union is by holding another referendum. And that a Boris Johnson might find it easier to make that step, particularly if that Boris Johnson then says, I am going to campaign as Prime Minister to persuade the public that we should be leaving the European Union. He'll probably make some waffly words about trying to come up with a hard Brexit, but effectively he's talking about permission in order to get the withdrawal treaty through. And that step may fill the bit of the jigsaw that's crucially missing at the moment, because insofar as people argue, look, the only way out of this impasse is to take it back to the people. The problem with this argument at the moment is that those on the Leave side are not convinced that this is a fair way out of the problem. Right? So it's a Remainers process so far. 2/3 of Remainers are now in front of it, favour only about 12% of Leavers. If, on the other hand, however, Boris Johnson were to go down that road, then maybe, but it won't be easy, and he might still find himself in exactly the same position with Theresa May. He can't get it through the House of Commons.
No, I mean, two points before I come to Sara. On that, in terms of this idea of Boris backs a second referendum. Remember Dominic Cummings, the man who we don't talk about enough these days, because Dominic Cummings, who ran the Leave campaign, without whom we would not be leaving the European Union, or we would not have had a Leave vote. Dominic Cummings, before the referendum, was an advocate or was sympathetic to the idea of a second referendum to hammer home the point. And Boris was at one point very interested in that idea. So I think there is some form there. And the second point, actually, talking of Leave campaigners, you identify, I think very rightly, the real fear on the Leave side of politics. If you talk to the people who ran the last referendum campaign for Leave, who would run the next campaign for Brexit in whatever form, they are really worried that in a second vote, it will be very hard to repeat that turnout bounce that they got in 2016.
Well,
now,
yeah,
and
sure.
John and I have had this conversation before, because John rightly points out the turnout bounce in 2016 has been exaggerated by some participants, but I'm simply reporting
by about 100 times,
in the terms of my old job as a journalist, that some of the participants in this process believe that turnout bounce was a real thing in 2016, and they believe that they would struggle to repeat it in the event of second referendum, which may condition the way they approach some of these decisions. Anyway, I'm going to shut up now and hand
but let me make one other point, right? If Boris campaigns and is willing to lead a Leave campaign, and also we've got Nigel Farage campaigning for Leave campaign, who's going to lead the Remain campaign? Who is the charismatic politician who is acceptable to Conservative, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, who would be the face of this campaign?
David Cameron's looking for a job these days.
Yeah, I think unfortunately he's got form on this issue.
Anyway, so we've just talked. We had a very a classic Brexit conversation, which is talking entirely about this in terms of domestic British public opinion, and what goes on in the British Parliament. We haven't talked about the other side. How would this go down in Brussels and the national capital?
Well,
so, Sara, in the event that Boris stands there on the steps of Downing Street, my friends, it's necessary to, are they just going to say, sling your hook, mate, or do they extend again? What are the options for extension, for changes to the process?
I mean, the thing is that this is an issue where the heads of state and government are in fact more divided than they've been on other issues. So we've seen, I think, from some of us who've studied EU for a long time, a sort of surprisingly united EU. I mean, they have really run this process in a very slick manner. Of course, if we end up with no deal, it's not been a success on either side. But they have really there's not been any.
And it wasn't just you that was surprised. I mean, the experts that were surprised. The Foreign Office was surprised. The British government was genuinely surprised by that degree of unity, wasn't it?
But here there is some divided opinion. I mean, we saw this with the last extension that, of course, Macron famously went in and wanted not to have an extension, and others wanted to have had a longer sort of 1 year plus extension. Now, so that means it's not as predictable as other things the EU do, and we can't take it for granted. A couple of things to say is that, first of all, I think if any request for an extension came with the promise of we're going to have another referendum, I think it would be very hard for them to turn it down. So if it would be Boris coming down and saying, no, we're going to have a referendum on this deal, for the EU then to say, no, we're not going to allow you time to have a democratic exercise, even if it was a general election. I mean, the words coming out of Brussels that any kind of democratic exercise, either a general election or a referendum, they would give time for that. The other thing, they might ask time for us just to say, no, we're leaving without a deal. We need some time to get our house in order, in which case also the EU being sort of risk averse and actually caring about the outcome of a no deal for everyone, they would probably allow some time for that. But I think the thing that would be hard for Boris is to go down and say, we need some more time so I can get this amazing deal in-house that I said I was going to deliver.
Alternative arrangements, Malthouse, Brady, technological solutions,
then I just don't think, and maybe Anand has a different view, that we really, then there would be a real fight inside the European Council of how to deal with that. And one of the reasons there is it's not necessarily that they disagree about the outcome they want, but what they disagree about is what is the best way of getting there. And one of the things I think is worrying that many people in Brussels, I think including Macron, thinks if we really say, no, this is a real hard deadline for no deal, and no deal happens, then the UK would come crawling back. That's what some people assume, quite quickly, and then they'd get the deal through. I.e., there'd be an agreement because the UK would see just how bad it is. So that's one strategic calculation. I'm not sure that's the right one, but that's why, we have to really have the problem is there's never really been a proper deadline, and that's one view, whereas other views is, one view, of course, Tusk really wanted to overturn it. He wanted it, to give Britain a chance to sort of potentially overturn it. Yeah. That's another view, and another view is, no, there's a real risk about.
And one brief thing, there are some quite compelling institutional reasons for the EU not to want this process to spill over, aren't there?
So, I mean, one big worry is, of course, going into the election function of the Commission, not just the Commission President. And another very big one is one we have to start now in the EU negotiating the next multi-annual framework, so the next budgetary period. And I mean, actually that tweet, I don't know if you recall, by Rees-Mogg, the brother, not the sister, on, we're going to go down and cause a lot of damage. That was mentioned a lot in Brussels. It was a real concern. They're going to cause, they're going to be trouble. And I actually went, no, don't want troublemakers.
So far, Britain has been relatively cooperative despite within the EU. Sorry, Anand.
Well, just a couple of things. I think the withdrawal agreement is the withdrawal agreement. And I think the only thing that would change the withdrawal agreement is a huge amount of increased trust. And that's not happening. So I don't think they change that document now, whatever the circumstances.
Trust levels are likely to fall not rise.
Yeah. So I think unless they really believe that we can trust them to play nicely in the future, we might be able to relax some of the terms. That's just not where we are at all. I mean, the second thing, I disagree slightly with Sara about the EU. I'm not sure the EU27 have been totally united. I think the EU27 have been united in not wanting to show their divisions. So they put in place a system that wouldn't let divisions between the member states come to the fore, and they stuck by it. And it surprised me that they stuck by it, but they did. And the final thing I'd say about an extension is this. For all that tweet by Jacob Rees-Mogg, in a way, certainly I think, is the MFF vote in June? I think it's scheduled for June, the first of the big votes next year that they have to start. Until then, it's quite good, isn't it? You essentially have a castrated Britain at the council table, not saying anything, not doing anything, not blocking anything, and we're paying our dues. What's not to like about that? I mean, that's a sort of French fantasy, isn't it? And so my sense is, unless we start playing up rough, and until we run into a deadline of serious MFF votes in which it becomes a real issue if we're voting, I don't really see why they wouldn't let us have another extension, as long as the extension is long enough to ensure that we don't clog up the businesses every European Council. I mean, once in every 4, they might be able to put up with. If we're back at the table every single European Council and they can't talk about anything else, that doesn't work.
But isn't it also, at the end of the day, as far as the European Union is concerned, victory for them is for us to change our minds. Second prize is at least we leave without a deal. And the point about holding a referendum is that even if Boris presents it domestically as an opportunity to affirm the Leave vote, for the European Union, it's an opportunity to see whether the United Kingdom is going to change its mind or not.
You mean leave with a deal? It's the second prize.
Second prize, leave without a deal. Second prize is leave without a deal, right?
Yes. That's only in Britain that's seen as a...
So it's creating space for a referendum where the choice is between Mrs May's deal and us changing our minds is a win-win for the EU.
And I also don't think that first prize for everyone anymore is seen as Britain changing its mind.
Yeah.
Because I think, the thing is that because we speak English here, everyone can read the newspapers and see what's been going on for 3 years, and they're starting to see, let's say there was another tight referendum the other way around. I mean, this would just be going on and on and on inside the EU.
We're never going to be more than so many detached members of the European Union.
But sorry, at one point you talked about there was a shared strategic objective among the EU27, but you didn't then spell out exactly what that is. What is the first best outcome here for the EU27?
I don't think there's people think now in Brussels that we're going to stay. Yeah. I think at the time that was a real hope, especially immediately afterwards.
So the first best choice is an orderly exit.
There's a very European answer to that, isn't there? The first best choice is a process choice. We remain united. That's the priority here.
No, before I'm trying to ask one question, which again starts off small and gets quite big. But starting with John. Now, in terms of voter behaviour tomorrow, the flip side of the conversation, we talked a bit about Tory vote. You've talked a lot about Tory votes going to the Brexit party. One of the oddities of voter behaviour up until recently has been that there are a lot of people in the UK who voted Remain, who want the United Kingdom to remain in or closely tied to the European Union, and yet have continued to indicate some degree of support for a Labour Party that is not wholly committed to that objective. Yeah. But are we starting to see that fraying? Are we actually about to start seeing large numbers of Labour Remainers leaving the party permanently or semi-permanently? And if they do, what does that mean for the future
This
of
is
the
the
Labour Party? And I'll just skip out the next three subordinate clauses of this sentence. Are we going to get a general election? If we do, what happens?
Right, okay. Gosh. That was a whole completely different question. The $64,000, I think the big unknown about what happens tomorrow is the relative position of Labour and Liberal Democrats. I mean, the poll that's just come out has Labour 18, Liberal Democrats 17. There are one or two polls that do put the two of them very close. One or two actually put the Liberal Democrats ahead. But there are others, such as Kantar, which also came out today in panel-based, that has Labour well ahead of the Liberal Democrats. All the polls agree, as I quoted earlier, the Labour Party is losing ground to the Democrats. The question is how much. But certainly, I mean, if it were to be the case that the Liberal Democrats were to overtake Labour in terms of the overall vote tally, that will definitely mean that they have got the more Remain votes, because they don't have the support of Leave voters. And I think, that is the big uncertainty about now what happens about Sunday night. I mean, I think the Conservative Party are going to be crucified. Brexit's going to come first. The question is who does come second. And there the polls are pointing in quite different directions. I think the honest truth is that if the Liberal Democrats were to overtake the Labour Party, then it won't just be Theresa May that is having a bit of a crisis over the weekend. But if
that does happen, it wouldn't just be the Conservatives who wouldn't really want the general election this year, would it? I mean, because the Labour position is officially we want a general election now. They don't really, do they?
Okay. Well, I mean, put it like this: they need to be careful what they wish for. I mean, on average at the moment, the Labour Party, both parties are well below 30%. The Labour Party is running at about 27, the Tories at about 23. Now, I mean, however you look at it, that is going to produce another hung parliament. Given the position in Scotland, it would probably produce a hung parliament that the Labour Party would almost undoubtedly need the support of the SNP to form a minority administration, and they might need the support of the Democrats as well. What will be one of the prices that those parties will extract? It was, we want a second EU referendum. Will Corbyn be able to deliver?
And a second Scottish independence referendum.
Well, yeah, but I'm going to leave that one for the moment.
Right? The breakup of the union is now a second order issue. But,
the honest truth is that one thing's happened. The Labour Party's lost strategic interest in Scotland. It hardly has any MPs from there, so it can afford to lose Scotland in a way that it previously couldn't. But let's just stick with the EU referendum, all right? Would a minority Labour administration be able to deliver a second EU referendum? Question mark. Or will we simply find that we have another minority administration that finds itself dependent on the support of a territorial party that represents the interests of one part of the UK, and it is unable to satisfy the conditions set by that partner? I mean, and the Labour Party finds itself in exactly the same position as Theresa May currently has been finding herself in for the last 18 months or so.
This is depressing.
It's a very simple issue of psephology, all right? If you make this, at the moment, the SNP will probably get about 50 seats.
Yep.
Given the Liberal Democrats are enjoying something of a partial recovery and the Tories are down, in the low 20s, must be at least 30 Liberal Democrat MPs. The 18 seats in Northern Ireland are not part of the British party system. So we've already got to, 98? Caroline Lucas, 99. Somebody else, you're at 100, right? So that's 100 MPs who are not part of the British two-party system, and you've got to get over in order to get an overall majority. Then simply remember, this is the first thing I ever wrote as academic, we don't have as many marginal seats as we once did. The electoral system doesn't turn seats over in relation to votes in the way that it once did. And that, the first thing somebody should have told Theresa May when she came back from her walk in Wales and saying, I want to hold a general election because I think I can get a landslide, is to say, Prime Minister, do you realise it took your predecessor a lead of 7 points just to get a majority of 12? Yeah. And so with the prospect of a House of Commons with 100 third-party MPs, because our electoral system no longer keeps third-party MPs out of the House of Commons, and it no longer exaggerates the lead of the largest party over the second party in the way that it once did, a hung parliament is by far and away the most likely outcome. And given that we know that a hung parliament together with internally divided government parties, dependent on the support of a party that is interested in the territorial interests of one part of the UK, is a recipe for impasse.
Doesn't end well. Right.
My question is really directed to John regarding the north of Ireland and the polling situation there, where we've had a situation where the backstop has been the real bane of Parliament's existence over the last period. And yet we had the north of Ireland which voted in favour of remaining. We've got the DUP who've been propping up Theresa May's government. Anti-LGBT rights. The recent unfortunate death of Lisa McKee. To what degree you think the votes in the Euro elections in the north of Ireland might produce some kind of radical change of direction?
Well, you know, radical change in Northern Ireland are words that don't easily go together, but the polling that came out, it was either this morning or yesterday, I mean, Sinn Féin won, DUP 2, Sinn Féin is something like 27, DUP something like 23. So that, you know, the two seats that they've got, they're going to hang on to. The battle is for the third seat. This morning's first preferences was UUP 11, SDLP 10, Alliance 10, which suggests that so long as she can keep into the count, and in particular she manages to get ahead of one or other of the UUP or the SDLP, that Naomi Long, the Alliance candidate, will have quite a good chance because, of course, she's much more likely to pick up second preferences than are the other two candidates. So there is a possibility that a party that's avowedly non-sectarian will get the third seat. Now, that's probably about as close as you get to radical change in Northern Ireland, and obviously it would be a continuation of the Alliance Party's relative success in the local elections earlier this month.
Based on conversations I've had recently, it looks like Boris Johnson has a very good chance of being the next leader and Prime Minister. And there is an idea that although Boris may be seen as a bit of a buffoon in Westminster, not least by his Conservative colleagues, that he's got this popularity outside of Westminster. And I'm just wondering, I guess it's a question for John, does the polling research actually back that hypothesis up?
Yes, it does. I mean, the two things you need to know. First is Boris Johnson is the only person anybody outside SW1 has ever heard of amongst the long litany of aspirants for the Conservative leadership. The second is that one of the pollsters, Hanbury, did in their most recent poll, they asked people, will you be more or less likely to vote for the Conservative Party if X becomes leader? Now, for the most part, I'm pretty sceptical about these questions, and certainly, you know, reporting the figures for the electorate as a whole is a waste of time. But what you could do with that was to look at the views of those who say they're going to vote for the Brexit Party tomorrow. For Boris, amongst those who voted for the Brexit Party, many more of the folk said that they would be more likely to vote for the Conservatives if Boris became leader than said they'd be less likely to do so. For all of the other candidates, the less likelies were more numerous than the more likely. So at this point in time at least, Boris can point to at least a degree of evidence that actually he might be able to reach out to those who have defected from the Conservative Party in a way that perhaps his rivals will not be able to do so. Now, that said, of course, his rivals might have a couple of months to raise their profile and maybe persuade Leave voters that he will be able to do so.
Certainly, the Boris camp want the transition done quickly, and all the other candidates want it to last a long time. Yeah. Can I just try and deflect your question on to either Sara or Anand, which is just to ask about the perceptions of Boris outside the UK, because I mean I know from old engagements. I mean there are a lot of people in the EU who have a personally very low opinion of Boris Johnson. And some of the noises off we get from Brussels suggest that his election as Prime Minister will be taken as a very bad sign, a sign of bad faith almost by the UK. Does that actually matter? How much do personal perceptions and how much do personalities matter in this process? Is this a purely institutional process, or do the way the 27, the 28 in the room get along actually, does that really matter?
I mean, it matters, but I think already with Theresa May, the trust has sort of eroded. So in that sense, so certainly Boris Johnson is not seen as an optimal choice, but it's one they think is likely. I mean, because of course, not only because he's a leaver, but because he's seen as someone who's not perhaps the most diplomatic in terms of how he deals with the EU, and he's seen as a bit of a sort of a populist, to put it in those kind of terms. And of course, for many in Europe, that's seen as the sort of the enemy. But I think in terms of the trust, I think there's not a lot left. And Anand already said it, because what they really wanted was the EU has made concessions, and they felt that they made concessions, and then Theresa May didn't deliver her end of the bargain, and was getting it through. So in that sense,
things like extending the old UK backstop.
So I don't think we are in a situation where we have a relationship with the EU and a prime minister where there's a deep sense of trust, and that would go. But I don't think also we are in a situation where certainly the perception is not that this would be an improvement. That's not the.
Yeah, but the problem with the concession that the EU made is that it made it more difficult for May to win the vote back home rather than easier, right? Because because it effectively raised the spectre of the whole of the UK being kept inside the customs union, and it made life more difficult rather than easier.
I think that's not so much the point. The point is more that she said certain things that she just couldn't deliver.
I'm extending this session by another hour so we can talk about the backstop and nothing else. Anyone who doesn't want that can leave now. Are there any more questions?
Professor Curtice, you talked about if there was a general election kind of soon, that SNP and Lib Dems likely to have an increase in the number of MPs in Parliament.
Yeah.
Are there any... Do the polling for the European elections, are they a basis on which you can make any prediction as to whether or not the Brexit Party would end up with some seats in Parliament? Because UKIP didn't really get any.
The answer to the first question is I have an academic colleague who is salivating at the prospect of modelling the geographical data on the Brexit Party's performance in the European elections to try to work out what that might mean for the party's prospects in a general election. I mean, the essential question is whether or not the Brexit Party vote is in any way more geographically concentrated than was the old UKIP vote. I don't think there's any great reason to expect that it should be, because the Leave vote itself was not that geographically concentrated.
Because you reprise briefly, if you would, the numbers for UKIP in 2015.
13% of the vote, no seats. Yeah. But, of course, it's irrelevant, because the leverage of the Eurosceptics does not lie in their ability to win seats. It lies in their ability to deny the Conservative Party seats, and that was the leverage that was crucial in Cameron's decision in 2013. On the question about turnout, well, the first thing I think I will say is that the one thing I would never rely on an opinion poll for is to try to forecast turnout. Because the problem that the opinion polls have is that they almost inevitably end up being more likely to interview those people who are likely to vote as those they are not. And if you look at the polls at the moment, they will find, they'll tell you that 55% of people are certain to vote in the election, which is probably not true. I can tell you on the basis of that evidence that the level of turnout in the European Parliament election will be lower than it would be in a general election, but that's probably nothing new to you. And the truth is, whether or not it's going to be more or less than the 35%, which is kind of the norm for European Parliament elections, is very, very difficult to call. The argument in one direction is, why bother, it's an irrelevance. Though, given how long we're now all agreeing it's likely to take for us to get out of this institution, assuming we do, maybe it's not quite such an irrelevance. But on the other hand, the opportunity to symbolically express your view about Brexit, and given that Sara and I would both agree, 40% of the public really, really strongly believe in either Remain or Leave, and they just may want to come out and say, this is what I believe, maybe the turnout will be higher. The two things that you can get out of the polls is that, one, it does look as though that engagement in this election has increased as the campaign has gone on. And there are certainly a couple of the pollsters, if you look at the trend over time, more people are saying they're certain to vote. The second is that there isn't any consistent evidence that Leavers are more likely to vote than Remainers or vice versa, and that such reticence as Leavers might initially have had of voting this election on the grounds that it shouldn't be taking place, I think has been balanced by the opportunity of affirming their faith in Nigel Farage and the Brexit Party.
Thank you very much. Now, we are slightly over the time I was told to shut up, so I'm going to shut up. Before I do that, I'm going to try and fail, I'm sure, to ask all of our panelists for predictions. We're almost at the halfway point of the year. Look forward, if you will, to the end of 2019. As the clock strikes 12, this year ends. 2 questions. Will Britain be a full member of the European Union? And who will be Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland? Who wants to go first? Anand, you're good at this stuff.
Yes, Boris Johnson, and we'll have an election before Easter.
Thank you.
Yes. Second one's much more difficult. It really will depend on...
Oh, come on, John.
Oh, no. The important about prediction is using it as a way of analysing what are the crucial contingencies. If this was simply a question of Tory MPs voting for whoever they thought was best able to get themselves over the electoral hole, then it would definitely be Boris Johnson. But that will be counterbalanced by the fact that there is many a Tory MP out there who doubt his ability to do the job effectively. And it's in which of those 2 things that emerge. And if he gets on the ballot, he'll make it. The thing that we don't know is whether he'll get on the ballot.
That's just so not a prediction yet.
No. And if you get
no, it's being honest. But
and if he gets on the ballot, will he remain Prime Minister until the end of 2019?
Well, I think we will only have an election by accident, i.e. that he will not be in a position to call an election voluntarily. No. And that probably that accident only happens if he's daft enough to try to pursue no deal.
Sara?
I mean, John is the one who's won all these prizes for predicting things, so I'd certainly...
But that's based on data, not on speculation.
So I don't want to... of course I'll have to agree with everything. I just think we shouldn't... There's always a tendency to sort of see things as this continuing patterns of what we've experienced. I don't think we should underestimate the risk that we might crash out on the 1st of November. We thought, we'll still be there by the end of the year. That's a possibility, but it could also be we get most likely a Prime Minister, a leader of the Conservative Party elected on a platform of pursuing a no deal and saying to everyone it'll be fine. And that could then happen then. And also on a platform probably of saying that he or she is going to play hardball with the EU. And the EU is also capable of playing hardball back. So I don't think that is a risk we should underestimate. And I think this is a greater risk than ever where we are now. Just because we've had extensions and we've had Parliament saying, we don't really like the idea of a no deal, doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And in that sense, I feel the mood is changing a bit. That it's seen more and more that you get more and more politicians saying, that's the default and that's probably going to be fine. So, I'm not going to give you some kind of probability because I simply don't know, but I just think we can't discount it. But no,
is a non-trivial probability. Yeah. But, lovely. Well, thank you on that happy note. I will say thank you very much to all of our speakers, to Anand Menon, John Curtice, Sara Hobolt. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to the snappily titled UK and thank you to Edelman. So thank you very much.